In this video, we're going to examine unseen correspondence and emails both to and from Lucy Letby. This dates back to 2013 and goes right up to 2018. In this initial examination, we'll go as far through the available correspondence and emails as we can. I'm doubtful that we'll get through the whole thing, but we'll continue this in a second part in the foreseeable future. So the very first piece of correspondence is a pro forma that was sent to or shared with Lucy in July 2013. And this relates to a mistake that Lucy made, described here as a clinical incident in which there was an errant drug calculation. You may be aware that the Thirlwell inquiry tried to use this against her in quite what I would describe as quite an underhand way. And this is related to a continuous infusion of morphine, and there was a mistake, not only by her, because she was accompanied by another nurse, so they both made a mistake. Of course, this is serious. It's something that can happen. There can be human error. It's something that we're all capable of doing. We're all fallible, and I will emphasise that I do try to be fair when speaking about hospital staff and people working on a neonatal unit, as I'm fully aware that I've never worked in such pressurised circumstances. If I make a mistake, then it's just some minor issue on a YouTube video, or it might be a typographic error or spelling error, or I can get something factual incorrect, but the consequences of this are not enormous. Whereas this is a very pressurised environment. I think we should always be fair to everyone that works in this environment, particularly those of us that have not worked in this environment. But we see here that the error was rectified quickly, no detrimental effect on infant, and sustain from checking any intravenous infusions requiring additives, any controlled drugs and complete intravenous competencies during calculations. These are the things that were required of Lucy as a result of this, and this note was to remain in the file. I believe it's for a period of 6 months. So I should just mention as well that the nurse filing that report was Yvonne Farmer. So shortly after this, there's a conversation here between Lucy, an email conversation between Lucy and Ruth Sadek. Ruth worked at the University of Chester at the time, where Lucy did her nursing qualifications. Ruth says, "Hi Lucy, how are you? What happened over the drug error? I hope you are okay." And Lucy says, "Thankfully, Ariane felt it had been escalated more than it needed to be. Everything is back to how it was. I just have to have more training on using the pumps, and it will be on my record for 6 months." She was very supportive, a case of learning to live with it now and getting my confidence back. I'm on nights this week, still feeling a bit vulnerable and thinking what if, but I'll get there in time. Thanks for asking, hoping you are okay. So this is a kind of indication of the human side of nursing, where, of course, you have emotions. We're human beings, and when you make a mistake, it can have an impact on you. So there's no further reference in this correspondence to this issue. It's an interesting place to begin because it's something that was deliberately blown out of proportion during the Thirlwell inquiry. I had forgotten that there is also this learning contract which goes right back to 2012. So this is when Lucy's taking her very first steps as a nurse. And again, this is with Yvonne Farmer, agreed with. And just a few little points about identifying different drugs given to neonatal patients, to be able to prioritise the care of patients allocated, to compile documentation, re-care of infants, and then there's a plan of how they're going to achieve that. So you can imagine Lucy being glad to agree this contract and looking forward to a career beginning, having little idea of what unfortunately lay ahead of her. So the next kind of correspondence, this is text messaging, seemingly. This is from the 12th to the 15th of June 2015, and this is when everything begins to go wrong on the neonatal unit when child A passes away. So Lucy here is involved in a conversation string seemingly with other nurses. And she begins by saying to this person she's corresponding with, Ashley, I'm not sure. Obviously, Ashley must be one of the nurses. I can't bring her surname to mind at the moment, but you may have heard by now, but wanted to let you know that we lost little child A on Monday. Know you looked after him when he was born, so thought you should know. Now, no doubt some sinister purpose was attached to this at some point during the court case, or at some point by the police, or at some point during the Thirlwell inquiry. But here we just see an interaction between nurses and the kind of emotions that they go through. I didn't know actually. Thanks for letting me know, Lucy. That's terrible. How is his sister? It was awful. He died very suddenly and unexpectedly just after handover. Not sure why it's gone to the coroner. Child B went off Tuesday night, was intubated but back on CPAP now. They are querying a clotting problem. Very sad. Oh God, he was doing really well when I left. I do hope child B continues to improve. Have they done bloods to check? So sad. He had a really good day on Monday, then I took over Monday night and he passed away at 20:58 after 30 minutes resus. Just collapsed very suddenly. Awful. Waiting for post-mortem results. Yes, they have done bloods and are liaising with Great Ormond Street. Hopefully they can get to the bottom of it. When are you in? Tomorrow? Little did Lucy know at this stage that Professor Arthur from Great Ormond Street would be giving evidence essentially against her in court, even though his study from Great Ormond Street doesn't actually support the prosecution. So let's move a little bit further down. It's so terrible and I'm sorry it happened while you were taking care of him. You're not having a great run at the moment. Hopefully we will find out soon. How are his parents? Did Mum get to see him? And yeah, I'm in tomorrow and Sunday. I wasn't supposed to be in either. Yvonne swapped my nights as unit busy. But these things happen, unfortunately. Parents were there during resus. They had them both baptised and spent the night sitting with them both. I took pictures, hand, footprints, etc. They are beside themselves worried that they might lose child B too. I'm Saturday, Sunday night. Yeah, it's the business we're in, unfortunately. Oh, okay, I'm glad they got to spend time with them both. I'm sure they're very concerned. Hopefully she'll be okay in the end. I'll see you tomorrow. Yes, they had time together and got some nice little mementos when they are ready to take them. Fingers crossed, see you tomorrow. Hope your day not too bad. And then there's more messages about, oh dear, what's going on? We've got 6 ITU, 3 discharges and Janet off sick. Eek, is someone being sent out? Have you got enough staff? No, has not got HDU, not all vented ITU, cause of lines. And then there's some sort of kind of trivial discussion about shifts and so forth. So, as you can see here, child D has passed away on the 22nd of June 2015. And Lucy says, we had such a rubbish night. Our job is just far too sad sometimes. And then there's a reaction from another nurse. What? But she was improving. What happened? Lucy says, messed about a couple of times and came out on this weird rash looking like overwhelming sepsis. Liz came in, rescreened, etc. And that's kind of the end of that discussion. As you can see, someone says, yes, but you've had it all recently. But we don't ever see if Lucy responded to that. But Lucy's citing sepsis actually several times with infants, and she was right. She was right to cite sepsis. I think this is in relation to child D. The implication here is that it's in relation to child D. So I don't necessarily think sepsis was critical in the case of child D, but Lucy's citation of sepsis was absolutely correct in various documents that are available at Thirlwell. So then there's some further messages here. I would kind of describe these as the kind of typical pointing out the faults in our workplace that we've probably all done. The difference here is that obviously people can die if mistakes are made. So Lucy says, but at least you had a voice in old handover, chance to say what you want. And we all left by 1940, but shift leader's still handing over baby, then doing unit handover and discussing the pending, so doubt that'll go down well, and guessing Ariane eventually wanting us to stay till 8. Yeah, there's something odd about that night and the other 3 that went so suddenly. Odd that we lost 3 and in different circumstances. I don't know, were they that different? And then Lucy says, ignore me, I'm speculating. Oh no, I don't think it is from Lucy. That last message is not from Lucy because it's it's just the same nurse. So yeah, just a bit of typical discussion that you would have, except that usually, as I say, in my workplaces you're discussing trivial things, where here you're discussing the death of babies, and that's just occupational hazard for these nurses. But again, these are messages that are perfectly normal, and yet we know about them because they're treated as exhibits in the court case, effectively. So the other bit that's relevant to Lucy is this very passive-aggressive response from Stephen Breary, where he says, just to confirm then, Ian and Alison are happy for Lucy to work on the neonatal unit in the same capacity as last week, despite the paediatric consultant body expressing our concerns that this may not be safe and that we would prefer her not to have further patient contact. Furthermore, they are happy to wait till Friday before we can discuss this in person. So I've outlined a lot of the background to Stephen Breary on this channel, and I've gone into it in even greater depth in my book. However, there's even more from the thermal inquiry, because he is a pretty canny operator, and he's he's always doing things on the unit and always saying things to people, and he knows how to play people off against each other, and this is a kind of very typical email from him, I would say. So there are a few other longer message threads that I'll go through in the future as well, but I'm going to save those for another video. The next thing we have here is this letter from Ariane Powell to various members of staff: Stephen Breary, Karen Townsend, Karen Rees and Murphy, on the 28th of June 2016. And Ariane says the following: I've spoken to Lucy this afternoon to ascertain her welfare in relation to the recent events on the unit. So this is obviously just before or just around the time Lucy's going to be pulled off the unit and will never go back on. Lucy's upset with the recent events, and I've referred her to occupational health for additional support. I have asked Lucy that she needs to ensure that she attempts to step back from the intensive care unit area for her own well-being. Lucy is happy with the debrief that was undertaken last week. I have informed her that she will be on days for a period of time and until she has attended the occupational health sessions. Lucy is obviously concerned that we have issues with her performance, as we are asking her to step down from the ITU environment. I have reiterated that this is primarily to protect her well-being. I have also informed her that we will be undertaking the mortality review as soon as possible, and as I have informed her in the past, looking in depth at all aspects of care throughout their stay on the neonatal unit. Just to clarify, we currently have the capacity to care for 3 ITU and 3 HD, not 3 ITU and 4 HD was previously stated. Therefore, I agree it would benefit the unit and the staff if we step down to 2 ITU and 3 HD, as stated by Steve, as reviewed closely. So this is indicating that they were over capacity, essentially. So next thing we have is on the 14th of July 2016. And this is a letter to Lucy from the Count of Chester. It's quite a lengthy letter, and it's signed off by Sian Williams, Deputy Director of Nursing and Quality, with Ariane Powell and Tony Millea being copied in. Tony Millea is Lucy's union representative. Ariane Powell, of course, is her ward manager. Dear Lucy, thank you for coming to see me today with your line manager, Ariane Powell. I explained that the purpose of the meeting was to discuss the recent events in the neonatal unit. As you have been away for a few weeks, I wanted to bring you up to date on the current position. You explained that you were aware that there had been an increase in mortality rates on the neonatal unit, and as a result, some of the cot spaces had been closed. I explained that this was correct and that the Trust was currently undertaking an in-depth review of the neonatal unit, including a number of factors such as dependency, acuity, safety, and staffing. The review which has been undertaken to date has been unable to explain the collapse or deterioration of babies on the neonatal unit in a number of cases. Clearly, this is of serious concern to the Trust, our clinicians, and is something that needs to be investigated further. The review which has been undertaken to date has revealed that a small number of staff were regularly involved in the care of the babies concerned. Their involvement was either on the shift or the shift before a baby had unexpectedly collapsed or deteriorated. As we discussed during our meeting, you have been identified as one of these members of staff. The review has identified you as being more regularly involved in the care of babies concerned. As we discussed, patient safety is of paramount importance, and the Trust needs to be able to provide assurance to its patients, staff, and members of the public that our staff are up-to-date, competent, and safe practitioners. Therefore, a decision has been made to provide additional support to all of the staff, including you, who have been identified in the review. The Trust will provide all staff who had been identified in the review as having had regularly involvement in the care of the babies concerned. I'm just reading this as it's written, by the way, with a period of supervised practice. This will involve a review of all clinical competencies. So you see here, we had this grievance document recently where Dr. Chris Green states there was never really any intention for other staff to review their competencies, and it certainly never happened. And it also wasn't transparently communicated to Lucy the nature of the allegations that had been made against her, and so she was kept in the dark. And while this is a courteous letter, and you could argue, if you're being generous, that this is being done to reassure Lucy at a time where she's in a stressful situation, it does seem that there is a bit of a lack of transparency here. I explained that you'll be the first nurse to undergo this process due to you being identified in the review as having been most regularly involved in the care of babies involved. But in fact, she was the only nurse. No one else have had to review their competencies. No one else was ever involved. The Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health are undertaking an external review of the neonatal unit commencing on the 18th of August 2016. The Trust has decided that you will remain subject to clinical supervision until the Trust has received feedback from the external review. Other staff who have been identified as being regularly involved in the care of babies concerned will also undergo a similar process. You were understandably upset and distressed by this decision and said that you would be very upset and could not live with yourself if any of your care had harmed a baby. So, I mean, that seems to be very typical of Lucy's nature. She seems to take things very hard. She seems to be quite sensitive and also enormously dedicated to her profession. I reassured you that the decision to provide you with clinical supervision should not be interpreted as apportioning blame, but was intended to be an additional supportive measure pending completion of the external review. So I think in some respects, what they're communicating to her was what the situation would be in an ideal world. Unfortunately, they're not living in an ideal world. They're living in a world in which they kind of know that Lucy's being accused of something very serious, and they have essentially failed to communicate that to her. So the letter continues. I gave examples of how, over time, that some deviation from good practices sometimes becomes norm, and this is not ideal. As I explained, this is no fault of individual, rather custom and practice. To assure this is not the case, we discussed that these supervising and refresher training programs are a good way to review and support the staff and would offer a way to ensure standards are maintained. During the meeting, we discussed an alternative to clinical supervision, being the option to take a short break from the neonatal unit. However, you confirmed that you would prefer to continue supervised practice. It was agreed that you would commence this on Monday the 18th of July 2016 and that you would take authorised leave until that date. I informed you that Ariane had arranged for our occupational health team to see you after our meeting to ensure you are receiving individual support as may be required during this period. The team and the staff support service are also available on extension. Ariane will keep me updated of your progress, but if you need to talk to me in person, please do not hesitate to contact me. So you see here this supervised practice that's going to take place on Monday the 18th of July 2016, or commence on that date, that was strongly opposed by the consultants and ultimately never happened. it seems that there were also some organisational and logistical issues in the hospital due to them being understaffed. If that had taken place, it's quite possible, perhaps even probable, that I wouldn't be sitting here now saying this. Very unlikely, you might argue. However, I do also think that it would have been very difficult, as I've said previously, for Lucy to go back onto that unit, and she was perhaps, as we'll see in later documents, being a little unrealistic to think that it could somehow be swept under the carpet and somehow working relationships could be rebuilt. I don't think that was ever realistic. The next document we have is an email from Karen Rees to Lucy, or it may even be a formal letter. It's written as a formal letter. So it may have been sent via email, but also sent as a formal letter or written that way. This is from Karen Rees, one of the nursing managers at the Countess of Chester, to Lucy. Dear Lucy, I write further to our meeting today. The meeting was attended by Yvonne Griffiths, Deputy Ward Manager. You were accompanied by Tony Millea at Royal College of Nursing, who, as I mentioned, was the union representative for Lucy. I attended the meeting, was accompanied by Linda Guatea, Human Resources Business Partner. Also present was Yvonne Farmer, Practice Development Nurse. During a meeting on the 14th of July 2016, you were informed that the Trust had undertaken an in-depth review of a number of factors on the neonatal unit, such as dependency, acuity, safety and staffing. The Trust confirmed that you would be placed under clinical supervision pending the completion of an external review by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health as an additional supportive measure. So what I should say at this point, before we continue with this letter, is that after this external review had taken place and had produced all of the recommendations and all the criticisms that we now know about, that would have been the point when Lucy should have been allowed back onto the unit, even if only with this supportive capacity, in this supportive capacity that's been mentioned. But of course that didn't happen because the consultant said, right, there's been a review and we're not happy with it because it didn't come to the conclusions that we wanted. But I think there's nothing that could have happened that would ever have resulted them saying, okay, we were wrong. I just don't think that's something that exists in their language. So let's continue. As explained today, unfortunately since the meeting on the 14th of July 2016, it has become apparent that it's not possible to provide you with full-time supervised practice at this time because of staffing levels on the neonatal unit. There are currently a number of members of staff who are absent from work for various reasons, including sickness, which has impacted on the availability of senior clinicians who are able to provide support. As explained during the meeting, the decision has been taken to redeploy you to work in another area of the Trust as an alternative to continue working under clinical supervision. The decision has been made to temporarily redeploy you to work with the risk management team under the direction of Ruth Millwood, Head of Service. So something to say here is, we know for a fact that the consultants strongly opposed this. So the reason is being presented here to Lucy is due to staffing, we couldn't provide you with full-time supervised practice. That could very feasibly be correct, or it could be viewed as a way of framing this to Lucy so it's more acceptable to her. We know they didn't tell her the truth about other things, and I don't wish to be too critical with regard to that, because it's a very difficult thing for the administrators in the hospital to say to her. You can't just write in a letter, "Dear Lucy, some people have accused you of murder, so we're taking you off the unit." It's obviously got to be handled delicately. Nevertheless, the grievance found that they weren't transparent with her, and I would question whether this is true. It could very well be true, but I think it's pretty much 50-50 as to whether that was the real reason, or as to whether they realised the consultants are just going to kick up a stink if we attempt this, so we can't attempt it. I explained that this temporary redeployment is a neutral act and has been taken in the best interest of all parties and in the interest of patient care pending completion of the external review. So that must have been incredibly hard for Lucy to take, and I think this is part of the reason why she wants to go back onto the unit, because she has been told, as a qualified neonatal nurse, having you on the unit would not be in the interest of patient care. So when I've said previously, I think, and I've said it already in this video, she shouldn't have tried to go back on the unit because it wasn't safe for her. I think a primary motivation, and perhaps my comments are therefore unfair, but perhaps a primary motivation is that she wants to prove herself. Like, I am a nurse, I'm a qualified nurse, I'm a competent nurse, I was a highly regarded nurse before all this happens. I've been told it's in the best interest of the neonatal unit for me to work in an administrative capacity, and that's in the interest of patient care. I want to prove myself. I want to show I do deserve to be a neonatal nurse. I do deserve to be on the unit. And that's a very natural human motivation. And I think from that perspective, I can understand it a lot more. And that would perhaps change my decision, because I would feel the same way. I know I would. So maybe I would think, right, well, I'm going to go back on the unit and prove myself. I don't know. It's very hard to say. You will continue to receive any enhancements to your pay. As we discussed, the Trust will review your redeployment following completion of the external review by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Your trade union representative, Tony Millea of the Royal College of Nursing, has confirmed that you would engage with the Trust in the redeployment process. You've now been introduced to Ruth Millward, who will be your line manager during your period of temporary redeployment. She will induct you to the patient experience team and will provide you with support during the redeployment process. So again, can you imagine how awkward this must have been for Lucy when she's just taken off the unit and said, right, we're going to stick you in this team. You know what workplaces are like. Certainly in my experience, there's almost inevitably gossiping, people talking behind your back, sometimes people stabbing you in the back. So it must have been awful for her to go onto that team, and then there'll be, I've seen jokes by Peter Kay about British people in restaurants and how they won't say anything to people's face, and then as soon as, like the waitress or the owner, and then as soon as they go, they start bitching about them. You can imagine they'd all be nice to, hi Lucy, oh thanks for joining the team, oh yeah, it's been unfortunate, never mind, sit down. Then as soon as she walks away to the water cooler, you can imagine, or like goes off on lunch, you can imagine the kind of things that were being said. It must have been awful. You raised with me the issue of personal support and stated that your friends are work colleagues. I advise you that the purpose of the redeployment was not to stop the usual social contact, but that you should be mindful of discussing any matters which may be sensitive in nature relating to the review of the neonatal unit. I am aware that you have been in contact with the Occupational Health Department and would reiterate that if you feel it would help, you are welcome to contact the Staff Support Service via the Occupational Health Team on extension whatever it was. Should you need to clarify any concerns regarding your temporary redeployment, please contact me. So in this letter, we learn numerous important details about Lucy's redeployment to this other unit, which must have been a very difficult thing. And already this is a very difficult time for her. Of course, things got much, much worse. But even this would have been kind of semi-humiliating and very troubling and very difficult for her, when she's probably proud of what she does and was a very dedicated and probably ambitious person. The next document we have is this one from what appears to be the 1st of September, and this follows a discussion between Lucy and Hayley Cooper, representative at the Royal College of Nursing, and there's some notes here between the two of them about what's been occurring and some background to Lucy. So some of this is quite interesting. Trained at the University of Chester, spent time in the neonatal unit, chose to work here 4.5 years, all induction, top band 5 level, specialist nurse, neonatal, centralised, to look after ventilated babies. 4 nurses, 2 times 6 or 1 times 2, 1 or 2 times 5, obviously referring to some sort of shift pattern I don't really understand. Oh, I guess these are bands, aren't they? 2 band 6 and band 5s. Try to adhere to guidelines, one-on-one, lots of ITU babies, 2 at a time, or 3 HDU babies. Waiting for opportunity to apply for band 6 roles, supervisory role usually, but not always possible. So as I mentioned, I think Lucy's ambitious. I think Lucy would have wanted to rise in her career and rise to a position of management on the unit. Good team, good rapport between med nursing staff, but different with consultants, more wary of going to them. One can understand why. Escalation, band 6, SHO Reg, not aware that this is written down, empowered to be heard, certainly to more junior staff. Delayed debriefs following death and on other events, not everyone can join, reliant on nursing staff pushing for it, positively received but time for it to be acted on. supported by medical team, but not so supported by nurse managers. Some debriefs initiated by Lucy Letby, who had to ask for them, taken off nights so more protected on days, told rather than agreed with Lucy Letby, redeployed, have no contact with the neonatal unit, referred to operational health, seen once, given leaflets, only doctors address access support from network or senior nurse managers, consultants not always empowering and supporting of nurses, slow to escalate to tertiary centres on occasion in Lucy Letby's view. So with regard to this, I'll mention that there is an explicit case that was reported on by The Guardian in which Lucy fought to have an infant transferred to a tertiary centre, and it would not have happened without her efforts, and she felt this infant requires tertiary care. And for political reasons that are perhaps becoming clearer and clearer the more that we look at this case, that was something that was opposed at the time, but only through Lucy's advocation was this infant transferred. And the mother actually told The Guardian, this was from an article in 2018, that she was grateful for what Lucy had done. Let's continue. Short of nursing staff, skill mix, lots of bank and agency nurses, most shifts have one agency. So we know about this. This is in my book, discussed in my book. I've probably discussed it on this channel as well. Lucy Letby will do 2 or 3 extra 12-hour shifts a month and or move shifts around to cover gaps. Again, we know this. We know Lucy was accommodating. We know that she was praised for this until we're in the court case where this is used against her. 30th of June, meeting with Ariane Powell. I'm not sure what DDON means. Total period of supervision and training. No prior warning. Practice concerns. No. Statistically there all the time. So RCN mating, not able to supervise to redeploy, which we already know. Contact, no others redeployed. Scapegoated. So it's the first mention of Lucy believing that she's being scapegoated and using the term scapegoated, which, as we've discussed, she definitely was scapegoated. That's undeniable. And we know that really there was never any intention, despite the fact she's been explicitly told other people are involved as well. There'll be other people who have to have their competencies assessed. She was told this. It appears there's absolutely no basis or foundation for this whatsoever. You could argue that she was, if you wanted to be generous, that she was told this to protect her feelings or to make her not worry as much. You could also put a less generous spin on it and say that this is just deliberately deceitful and they're not telling her the truth. And indeed, that was the conclusion that Dr. Chris Green came to as a result of the grievance procedure. So continues, no reason or evidence to redeploy, waiting for this review before RCN increase role, launch a grievance. So she's thinking at this point about potentially launching a grievance. Whether or not this was calamitous for her, whether things would have worked out the way they did if she hadn't launched a grievance, we will never know. I think it's quite possible they would have just continued anyway, because after the Royal College review, the consultants weren't happy and wouldn't accept it. So they probably very likely would have just continued anyway. But it's clear that they were piqued, to use J. Ram's word, by the grievance. And this ultimately counted against Lucy, even though all the points of the grievance were upheld. And we're going to go into more information about the grievance in this video, and I'll make more videos in the future about the grievance, even though we've seen the conclusion. But there's much more interesting detail that we haven't been over yet. Under impression, RCPCH had asked for Lucy Letby to be redeployed, which is not true. I don't know, it seems that Lucy's under that impression, but so that suggests she hasn't seen the RCPCH report. We know that it's been redacted since. We don't know to what extent that was a public document at the time, but, it sounds like Chinese whispers. There's been lots of rumours, just everything I described previously, and it was probably conveyed to Lucy, the RCPCH asked for you to be redeployed, which is not true. It's the complete opposite. They said that she had been redeployed, and then they wrote a lot of essentially glowing praise of Lucy. So that's it seems that the person conducting this interview, the union representative, doesn't know either that the RCPCH have not said this. Finally, redeployment done under question mark policy, feeling very vulnerable, feels everyone has turned their back on her, as you would expect. So already, emotionally, she's going through a lot. Everything is being torn apart for her, and you can imagine the mindset under which she's written this green post-it note that has been later very obviously incorrectly deemed to be a confession. It's because of the vulnerable feeling. It must have been awful for her to go into this workplace every day under these circumstances. Hardly surprising that she's feeling vulnerable. So the next document we have is from the very next day, the 2nd of September. I'm not going to read the response of Alison Kelly, but she responds favourably to this email from Tony Millea. So Tony Millea, as I mentioned, is the union representative. He's copied in Hayley Cooper, who was just in that previous meeting, and Alison Kelly, who has a senior position at the Council of Chester. And Tony writes the following: Dear Karen, following our telephone conversation of the 2nd of September 2016, so obviously on the same day, he's phoned up Karen and said, I'm going to write to you to say the following: I have serious concerns. I felt it necessary to follow this up in a letter. The reason for my call, as you know, was to highlight my grave concerns in relation to the Trust's treatment of our member, Lucy Letby. As you are aware, there have been unacceptable high mortality rate on the neonatal unit at the Council of Chester. It has been alleged that our member has been involved with more of the deceased patients than any other member of staff. To date, there has been no evidence provided by the Trust to substantiate this allegation. As a result of these allegations, it was initially decided by the Trust that our member would have to work under direct supervision and an action plan would have to be followed, and she would have to redo all of her clinical skills and competencies as per what would be expected of a newly qualified nurse. Again, you can imagine this would have been, although it never actually happened, this would have been pretty humiliating for Lucy. They'd be basically saying to her, you're not competent, even though there's no actual evidence she's done anything wrong. This was communicated to Lucy in a meeting on the 14th of July 2016 by Sian Williams. It's also ironic when we now know some of the very explicit mistakes that have been made on this unit in terms of clinical practice. Some of these are physical, some of these are diagnostic, some of them are practice, some of them are understanding, but collectively we know that doctors have made a lot of mistakes on this unit. That's undeniable. I don't think anyone can reasonably deny that. And yet it's Lucy that's been targeted, scapegoated, removed, and then told, you're at fault, you now have to redo everything as if you're not a competent nurse. That would be awful for anyone to go through in their profession. In any profession, even if it's one you don't particularly value or don't particularly care about, it's just a job that you're doing, that would be pretty humiliating for anyone, I would say. But when it's something that you wanted to do all your life, when you've studied for years, when you've been through supervised practice to reach the standard of a neonatal nurse, when you're highly regarded on the unit, when you're ambitious and you want to push beyond that and become a band 6 and then a band 7 seemingly, it must have been awful for her. I mean, I can speak as someone who, my occupation, not so much YouTube, although I suppose that's becoming true as well, but certainly as a writer, that's pretty much my identity, really. That's what I do all the time. And obviously, it's a profession I chose and I value it very highly. I would imagine it's very similar for Lucy. I'd imagine that being a nurse is a fundamental part of her identity. And then, of course, the stakes are higher with being a nurse because if you lose a bit of confidence, these are life or death situations. So you've got to be able to act with confidence at all times. So this would have been enormously damaging to her. And you can perhaps understand in that context why she took what many view as the risky move of launching a grievance against the hospital. And I think that's something that I would feel that I had to do myself as well. I think I would feel exactly the same way. I'm like, I'm being blamed for everything. No one's even proved that I've done anything wrong. Why is this happening to me? It's completely unfair. I'm being humiliated. This is completely unacceptable. So I can absolutely understand why Lucy did that, and I think it's important to understand the context of what was occurring. So I'll continue with the letter. This course of action was never followed by the Trust due to the fact that another meeting was called on the 18th of July 2016, chaired by yourself and Linda Guatea, HR business partner. When it was communicated to Lucy that it became apparent that it was not possible to provide her with full-time supervised practice at this time because of staffing levels on the neonatal unit, The decision was taken by the Trust at this time to redeploy Lucy on a temporary basis to work with the risk management team. We understood and accepted that this decision was taken in the best interest of all parties and in the interest of patient care, pending completion of an external review. I am now aware that the independent external review has commenced, and Lucy was interviewed on the 1st of September by the panel. Lucy was accompanied by Hayley Cooper, staff side chair. It is following this meeting that my concerns have deepened. This is due to the fact that the terms of reference for the investigation does not seem to address the initial Trust concerns they have in relation to the unacceptable high mortality rate on the neonatal unit and our members' involvement. Instead, the investigation centred around procedure, culture, staffing levels, and what was it like to work on the neonatal unit. No question of our members' involvement was discussed. In fact, it was imparted by the panel that the review will not solve the issues for Lucy personally. So there's a few things to say about this. The first thing is, it's obviously relevant here that the panel imparted that the review would not solve the issues. So from Lucy's perspective, the Royal College review has not helped her in the slightest. The second thing to say is, it is important to note that these comments from Tony Millea are fair, and it was not entirely unreasonable of the consultants to say that the Royal College review had not been medical enough. That there had been some assessment of the infants, and of course there'd been, when coupled with all of the other examinations that took place from Jane Horden, from Joe McPartland, from pathologists, coroners, etc., you would think that would be acceptable. But it is not entirely unreasonable of the consultants to say, we want a full medical review into the neonatal unit, and we want to understand all of the aspects related to the passing of these infants. That's not an unreasonable thing for them to say, even though they're hand-waving all the evidence that contradicts their belief system. But that's not a reason for a police referral, as we have seen from the shambolic investigation conducted by Cheshire Police. They have no... It's harder now. I mean, I used to say they have no concept of how to run a medical investigation. Of course, that's true, but they were told what to do. They were given pretty clear guidelines of what they should be doing. I still don't think that's enough. I still think they're nowhere near the level required to conduct this, and it should be done by an external medical body. But of course, they ignored what they were advised to do by the National Crime Agency. So, utter incompetence on behalf of the police. They're less able to run this investigation than I would have imagined, because I would have thought that they were capable of following basic advice that is obviously needed, and that is obviously very sensible. But the maniacal insistence of the consultants that this was reviewed to the police makes no sense. One wonders what their motives were in insisting on this, rather than insisting there's an external medical review, which would have been obviously far better. One wonders if they were seeking to help define the terms of this, that's why they go to the police on the 15th of May. So they go to see the Cheshire Constabulary on the 15th of May, and they seed them with the information required, which then results in the investigation being weighted towards that information. And it seems, because of the email we've seen from Dr. Jairam, in which he says, we need to pique the interest of the police, it seems that there was a conscious effort to do that. Now, I think, to some extent, what the consultants believed was that we need to make it clear that there is the need for a police investigation. I don't think they could possibly have anticipated that the police would do such an incompetent job. So I don't think it was necessarily that they were trying to guide the investigation. I think they were just trying to ensure that an investigation took place. However, what they effectively did was ensure that the investigation was prejudiced from day one, whereas an external medical body would not have accepted any input from the consultants. They would have spoken to them, but they would have had very clear guidelines in place. They would have known exactly what they were doing. They would have examined the neonatal unit, and they would have found, in all probability, a lot of the problems that have been found by the expert panel, even though they may not have been as experienced, as high level as that panel. They would, more than likely, given all the clinical notes and so forth, they would have identified issues, and those issues would not have pointed to Lucy Letby. So at this point, this issue that's being identified by Tony Millea, if that had been acted on adequately by the hospital, if the hospital, instead of appeasing Brewery and J-Ram, and bear in mind as well, the executive did go to the police and say, look, there's no basis to have a police investigation. But if instead of doing that, if instead they had said, look, the police are not the right body to investigate this, you want to understand what happened medically, we need to have a full medical external investigation by an independent body of the highest calibre. If they'd done that, then Lucy would have been exonerated. What would have happened from there, we can only predict. It's impossible to say. They might still have pushed to go to the police, but they would have had a much weaker position to do that if an external body had examined the hospital. So I'll just continue with the final couple of paragraphs of this letter. It has also recently come to my attention that our members' recent move to risk management is a result of the Trust's response to either a number of consultants or a consultant's comments about members' practice. Again, if this is a true reflection, then I would like to request to see the Trust's evidence to substantiate their actions following these comments. So we know for a fact that is definitely true. We have that in black and white elsewhere. So that calls into question whether this explanation about, oh, we can't do supervised practice, Lucy, because we can't spare enough staff, that is plausible, that could be true, but this definitely calls into question whether or not it is actually true. Then the final paragraph. As a result of this, I now believe our member has grounds to action a grievance, which is absolutely true. Of course, she won the grievance very, very comfortably. Given the gravitas of what is being alleged by the organisation, I believe our member has a right to be fully consulted and a full and frank explanation is given by the organisation into my concerns. The allegations that have been made by the Trust could have a detrimental effect on our member's career, which may constitute professional slander resulting in our member being constructively dismissed from the organisation. So as I've said, Lucy should have gone for this ultimately after the grievance. I understand why she didn't, but she knew there was slander. She wrote it in one of her notes. She knew there'd been discrimination. She'd won her grievance. She very, very likely would have won a constructive dismissal case. But there's no point dwelling on that anymore. I've discussed this previously. Once again, I have to request that the Trust provide me with the evidence they have to suggest that our member may be the only nurse linked to these unexplained mortality rates. Why is she the only member of staff to be excluded from the neonatal unit? I feel the organisation now need to review their position and to reinstate our member back to a substantive role on the neonatal unit. So, I mean, there was a very strong argument for this, for sure. But a very strong letter from Tony Millea there, and that would be the foundation of why Lucy felt she was justified in launching a grievance, which she then won, and then she must have thought she was vindicated by that. I mean, kind of reading back through this correspondence now, it's kind of like watching a horror movie or maybe a disaster movie, something like, you know, a film where an aeroplane's going to crash, and yet after there's this film that the movie Airplane is based on, and they were quite popular for a while, these disaster movies, and watching this is like watching a disaster movie. So I think it's then interesting to go back and look at this letter from the 5th of August 2016. So this is before the previous correspondence in chronology, and there's some interesting stuff in this letter, written by Karen Rees, head of nursing at the hospital, to Lucy. Dear Lucy, thank you for meeting with me today, the purpose of which was to update you and to inquire regarding your welfare. You were accompanied by Hayley Cooper, RCN representative. At our last meeting on the 18th of July 2016, I had informed you that your period of redeployment would be in place and would be reviewed following completion of the external review by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Unfortunately, I was sorry to inform you that the start date for their review has been deferred until the first week in September 2016. So Lucy's basically being informed here, once there's been this external review, we're going to look at your position about being redeployed. Initially, the redeployment it's sold to Lucy as being a very temporary thing until there's this review. Once this review has happened, then you'll be back on the unit, basically. And that's why Lucy's probably gone to a union rep and said, look, I've heard some stuff, this review's happened, blah, 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 what's going on? And that's why her union representative has written this forceful letter. I inquired regarding your well-being. Understandably, you stated that you wish to return to your substantive role as soon as possible, which is entirely what you would expect. I am aware that you have been in contact with the Occupational Health Department and would reiterate that if you feel it would help you, you are welcome to contact the Staff Support Service via the Occupational Health Team. In the meantime, I will continue to maintain regular contact with you. Should you need to clarify any concerns regarding your temporary redeployment, please contact me. So this helps fill in some useful gaps regarding what was happening on the unit at the time, what Lucy was feeling, what she was promised, and what actually happened. So the next important piece of correspondence we have is on the 26th of October 2016. This is from Sue Hodkinson to Lucy. I think, let's actually have a look at her position. Sue Hodkinson is the Director of People and Organisational Development, so it's a HR personnel position at the hospital. Dear Lucy, following our meeting on Thursday the 20th of October 2016 with Karen Rees, Head of Nursing Urgent Care, and Hayley Cooper, RCN Representative and Staff Side Chair, where Alison Kelly, Director of Nursing and Quality, and myself were also in attendance, Alison and I would like to provide a summary of the points we discussed within the meeting. So obviously Lucy's had this very important meeting with several key personnel at the hospital who are involved in HR and nursing. This was a follow-up to our initial meeting with you on Wednesday the 5th of October 2016. We again explained that this was an informal meeting and that a separate process was underway to address the points raised within your grievance. Alison and I thanked you for meeting with us at our previous meeting, and you explained that you were concerned that you had heard through a handover process within the neonatal unit that the external report had been received by the Trust at the start of the week. Alison explained that the draft report had been received, but that it was received on Tuesday the 18th of October and no earlier. She added that she was unsure how this information had been relayed to you, but that it was factually incorrect. So Lucy's been told in the first week of September your redeployment will be over. Basically, there'll have been a review, there'll be an external review, you'll be back on the unit, and so on. So this is why she's calling these meetings to say, right, initially I've been told, oh, you're just one of several people who happen to be around, and you're just one of several people who have their competencies reassessed, and this will be a temporary thing. It'll take a few weeks, and then you'll be back on the unit. So when you understand all this context, and the fact a union rep said you've definitely got cause for a grievance here, you can see why, firstly, she's annoyed, secondly, why she feels vulnerable and isolated, and thirdly, why she's raised the grievance in the first place. So I'll move on to the next paragraph. You asked if there was then a deep dive clinical review required as part of the external review and what the process and timescales were for this. So as I mentioned, there is justification, I'd say significant justification, for there to be a deep dive clinical review. This should have happened, given the wealth of mistakes that were made on this unit and the number of problems that occurred. Now, had there been a deep dive clinical review, this would not have been great for Dr. Stephen Breary, Dr. Ravi Jairam, or several other consultants, because they would have identified some of the clinical mistakes made by the consultants themselves. And Lucy would have been vindicated and exonerated by this. So the actual outcome and the politics of what would have occurred on the unit under these circumstances would have been fascinating. As I say, we don't know whether they would have continued pushing for police involvement, so Lucy may still have ended up in this horrible situation, but she may not have done, and we may never have heard about it. There's just no way of knowing. Alison explained that this was a recommendation of the external review, and that this was advised on the receipt of the initial verbal feedback of the review. She added that it was hoped that the timelines for this deep dive clinical review and the receipt of the draft report would be aligned, but as we were working with external colleagues, this had not been possible. In addition, I added that due to the complexity of pulling together the clinical records in the Trust, this process had taken longer than anticipated, and that the clinical review had now commenced. So I'm not sure how true that is, because they never actually do a clinical review. all that happens is the consultants pester the executives to go to the police, and then they go to the police. I'm not sure that the clinical review was ever completed. I've certainly seen no evidence that it was. You asked Alison and I what the timescales were for this being completed, and we both explained that we did not know at this stage, but would try to obtain some clarity on this information from Mr. Harvey, the medical director who was leading this piece of work. Unfortunately, Mr. Harvey is currently on leave, so we haven't been able to get the timescales for you, but we will aim to provide you with an update on this when we next meet. So you can imagine this is extremely stressful probably for Ian Harvey, Tony Chambers and Stephen Cross as well, particularly Harvey and Chambers. Meanwhile, Lucy is thinking, what the hell's going on? We've now gone 6-7 weeks outside the timeline that I was told. I've been told a pack of lies, that's very clear. When am I going to be treated with some dignity or respect? And one can entirely understand why she felt that way. And indeed, she speaks about this in the letter speaks about Lucy's views and feelings in the very next paragraph. You explained how you had now been off the unit for 16 weeks and that you just wanted to return back to the team. Both Alison and I acknowledged this position and explained that the draft report needed to be reviewed and it would be a board decision around considering the information. So another key issue here is Lucy's isolation. She's feeling more and more alone, which would be a problem for, I think, most people, but she relies on her team, as we've discussed in previous videos, as is very evident. She relies on her team for support, and she has close relationships with them, and nursing is a very close-knit profession where you have to work together, and she feels she's becoming more and more separated from her team and that she should be working again. So the letter continues. We explained that we would represent your concerns within the board conversations and would continue to keep you updated on how this was progressing. As part of this, we agreed that we would all meet again in 2 weeks' time, and this meeting has been arranged for Wednesday the 2nd November 2016 at 1 p.m, again in Karen Rees's office. You asked about the grievance process and who would be hearing the grievance. I explained that Dr. Chris Green, Director of Pharmacy, was acting as the investigating manager and that Alison had arranged for an independent external manager to hear your grievance to support the independent review of the information and to support you as best as possible. So this is nothing that we don't know already, but I guess it's just important to emphasise that this was an entirely independent process. These are not internal people from the hospital, and to be fair, that's the only way for Lucy to get a fair hearing, because as you heard Martin say, Martin Pittman, there would have been massive pressure put on the grievance process to favour the consultants, by the consultants and by the hospital, potentially. So the independence is a massive plus for the grievance, and it just indicates how poorly Lucy was treated, that someone independent can come in there, look at everything and uphold everything that she had stated. I have asked for a letter to be sent to you explaining who will be hearing the grievance, which is planned to be heard on the 15th of November 2016. In the meantime, I can confirm that Annette Weatherly, Deputy Chief Nurse, University Hospital of South Manchester NHS Foundation Trust, will be hearing the grievance with D. Appleton Kearns, Deputy Director of HR, also present to support Annette. Both Hayley and yourself asked why you were temporarily redeployed from the unit and that this was extremely difficult for you. Alison and I explained that we absolutely understood this and thanked you for remaining in work. I explained that you were not under investigation, but that we had temporarily redeployed you as a supportive measure as it was a vulnerable environment with some of the comments we had been made aware of. We explained that you may want to raise this further within the grievance hearing, but recognised that we should have been more open with you at the start about this issue. You explained that you had a right to know, which we acknowledged. So this will be upheld in a grievance, and I do think that the comments here in this letter about it being a vulnerable environment, and it was very difficult for them to communicate this adequately to Lucy. They were put in a very difficult position, and I feel that we should defend them to some extent, because although absolutely, as is acknowledged here, they should have been more transparent and more open, I don't think that can reasonably be contested. But I also think it's a very delicate position where accusations of murder have been made, and as an HR team and a nursing team you have to handle that, it must be extreme. There's all kinds of legal concerns as well. It is very difficult, and I do sympathise with them. They're trying to put it delicately to Lucy so that the whole thing doesn't blow up even more than it has already. Obviously, I think the way that they expressed it and the fact Lucy wasn't kept in the loop and wasn't told the truth is wrong, and it's absolutely correct to acknowledge that. We talked about when you returned to the unit, and I asked you what you would want to ensure you were supported as best as possible on your return. You explained that you would be keen to return as soon as possible after a phased period. Karen reiterated that she would ensure that this was planned with you and Hayley so that you felt supported throughout the process. During the meeting, I asked if you needed any additional support and if you were still receiving clinical updates from the senior team within the neonatal unit. You advised that you had not met with Ariane or Yvonne recently. Karen and I assured you that we would follow up on this for you, and I now understand that this has been reinstated now that Ariane is back from annual leave. Both Alison and I reiterated that we were concerned around your health and well-being, and that we needed to continue to check with you if any additional support was needed. As you requested within our meeting, I have enclosed the grievance policy for you so that you have guidance on how the process is undertaken. Both Alison and I again acknowledged that this is an extremely stressful situation for you, and we all agreed that it would be helpful if we could meet again. As stated earlier, I understand this meeting has been arranged for 1 p.m. on Wednesday the 2nd of November 2016 in Karen Rees's office. As we discussed in our meeting, whilst we know that you have support already available from occupational health, please be aware the service can be accessed by telephoning this number. So this letter kind of acknowledges all the problems that Lucy has been going through, the difficult situation that she's in, the support that is available to her, the fact that support would be expected to be needed by Lucy, and finally some of the problems that have occurred on the unit, some of the mistakes that have been made, and some of the, I think we could reasonably describe it as suboptimal treatment that Lucy has been exposed to. So then on the 1st of December 2016, Lucy receives this letter, which is the outcome of her grievance. I'm not going to read this out in full because I've read it out, I think, more than once on the channel. Certainly I've read it out previously. But we see that all 7 points are upheld. This letter, right at the bottom here, it goes on, is written by Annette Weatherly, who's an important person at the hospital. And in addition to all the grievance being upheld, there's then a long explanation here. No party refutes that concerns were raised by the consultants, in particular Stephen Berry, to the executive team around a perceived commonality between your presence on the neonatal unit and the collapsed deaths of babies. And it goes on to discuss this. I conclude that no formal allegations have been made with relation to you from any party. In response to how the Trust have dealt with this, I conclude that the Trust have considered the concerns of consultants in line with both the disciplinary and Speak Out Safely policies, and believe there's an insufficient basis on which to undertake either a formal internal investigation or to initiate a police investigation. So it's a critical point. So they had no basis on which to refer this to the police. So this should never have gone to the police because they provided no evidence between this time and the ultimate referral to the police. As mentioned previously, there should have been an external medical investigation if anything was going to be done at all. And so Annette Weatherly says, I consider that there were a number of potential options available to the Trust. To initiate an internal investigation under the Trust disciplinary policy, I find that given the nature of the allegations that this was not feasible, as if there was sufficient evidence the police should have been contacted in line with the policy. Of course, we know there wasn't sufficient evidence. To contact the police as above and request an investigation, I find that the Executive Board did not feel there was sufficient evidence to undertake this action. To exclude you from duty whilst the external review and deep dive forensic review was undertaken, to redeploy you as an alternative to exclusion. I conclude, therefore, the action of removing you from the neonatal unit while the external review and deep dive forensic reviews were undertaken was within a range of reasonable responses available, as it was believed that these reports would provide further information that would clarify any concerns regarding any deliberate action resulting in patient harm. So then, finally, there's numerous ways that the Trust will support Lucy. CEO and a non-executive representative will apologise. it'll be put to her in writing that there's no case to answer. There'll be mediation with consultants, an apology from consultants, although they didn't mean the apology. They said that there was no, they made it very clear in their public statements that there was no sincerity behind this whatsoever. Karen Rees was assigned to Lucy as a mentor, and there was also support in completion of a master's or advanced neonatal course. This is in recognition of the time lost from clinical practice. So Lucy would have been supported through a master's. And if things are, maybe that be, I've said previously she should never have gone back on the unit. I can't change that view, but the more that we consider it and the more we learn about it and the more we think about her position, the more we try and understand and empathise with the circumstances she was in, the more one can understand why she did want to go back onto the unit, why there were incentives for her to go back on the unit, and that this would be just another one. So perhaps I would have done the same thing as her. I don't know. I would just be extremely wary about going back into a workplace where people have accused me of murdering anyone. I just don't see how you can ever mend those relationships, and you're extremely vulnerable if anything goes wrong. There's always the possibility there could be more deaths on the unit because of the type of work that you're doing, and if there are, even if explicit accusations aren't made, there's going to be whispers, and you're just putting yourself in an extremely vulnerable position, unfortunately. And funding a master's degree is not enough to offset that, in my view. But it does give an explanation, yet another reason why Lucy wanted to progress, Lucy was ambitious, Lucy wanted to reach the peak of her profession. And she perhaps thought, well, if I'm transparent in everything I do, then I've got this vindication from the hospital, I can be accepted back into the fold, I can mend my relationships with the consultants, I've got good relationships with my nursing team, I'll be able to reintegrate myself. Over time, people will accept me and everything will work out okay. I'm not sure that was ever possible, but I can see why she might feel that way. So I'll just finally read the summary. This was obviously a very unique, complex and sensitive situation. While it is accepted that the executive team could have been more open with you, communicating with you in a more regular and coordinated way, this chair believes that the executive team has acted in a balanced way with regards to the best interests of you, the trust, and the families of the babies. I agree with that. I think it's a very difficult situation, and although not everything was necessarily handled perfectly, it's an incredibly difficult situation. And I can understand why they communicated the way that they did. However, it is clearly evident within the witness statements that your movement from the unit was orchestrated by the consultants with no hard evidence to support this action. Their behaviours and comments, as witnessed by a number of senior managers and executive staff, all fall far short of what is expected by the Trust and professional standards. This behaviour has directly resulted in you, a junior colleague and fellow professional, feeling isolated and vulnerable and putting your reputation in question. This is unacceptable and could be viewed as victimisation. Immediate steps need to be taken to address these behaviours, ideally through mediation with Dr. Breary and Dr. Jairam, and with apologies from all of the named consultants who made unsubstantiated comments. McCormack, Breary, Jairam and Dr. V. It is hoped that these measures will support you back into the neonatal unit and achieve a harmonious working environment for everyone. Failure to comply with these reasonable measures from the named parties should result in disciplinary action taken by the Trust. The Chair would like to thank the investigating officer for a thorough, balanced and honest investigation report. This has clearly been a very distressing case for all involved, and I would like to thank everyone for their time, patience and candour. So I think a very reasonable summary of what had occurred on the unit. Obviously, very interesting comments about Lucy having been victimised and about the movement having been orchestrated by consultants. Very strong statements, I'm sure you'll agree. So we'll leave this correspondence analysis here at the point at which Lucy has had a grievance accepted, and we'll pick it up another time. We're only about 1/3 of the way through available correspondence, but this has been an interesting insight into what happened in those early days at the hospital up to the point where Lucy's grievance has been accepted. The next time will continue in 2017 as things continue to escalate. I will finally summarise what we've learnt from this correspondence and what we've learnt about the Count of Chester and Lucy's situation during this period. The earliest material that we have shows Lucy Letby dealing with an ordinary clinical error in a pressurised neonatal environment, a 2013 drug calculation incident that was corrected quickly and later discussed in a supportive way with a former tutor. This is simply normal human fallibility coupled with the challenges of nursing practice and the emotional strain that inevitably comes with it. Texts from 2015 then show a unit dealing with repeated tragedy, sudden deteriorations, deaths, transfers, staffing pressure, and the practical aftermath of neonatal loss. These messages read simply like colleagues trying to cope with grief, shift disruption, and clinical uncertainty. In that same period, Lucy is shown discussing sepsis, staffing, and the pressures of the ward in a way that is consistent with an informed, engaged, and conscientious nurse rather than a detached or suspicious figure. The major turning point comes in 2016 when Lucy is removed from the unit and told that supervised practice, review and support will follow. The correspondence repeatedly indicates that this is supposed to be protective and temporary, but it is clear that communication was not fully transparent and that Lucy was never properly told what was being inferred about her. The letters also show how she was moved away from the neonatal unit, first into a supervised framework and then into redeployment, which must have been humiliating, isolating, and emotionally distressing for someone whose identity was almost inevitably entwined with her clinical role. That sense of isolation becomes even clearer in correspondence from September 2016. By this stage, Lucy is feeling vulnerable, scapegoated, and abandoned, while her representative raises serious objections to the Trust's treatment of her. The union letter is especially important because it indicates that there was no evidence provided to justify the allegations, no proper basis for the action taken, and a strong case for a grievance. This is a key moment. Lucy is not just unhappy, but vindicated in formally challenging what has happened to her and demanding a full explanation. The October 2016 letters then show delays, uncertainty, and shifting explanations continuing. Lucy is told again that the external review is not ready, that the timescale is unclear, and that she is still expected to wait while the process develops. This prolonged uncertainty inevitably deepened the damage. Lucy wanted to return to work but was left in limbo, increasingly separated from her team, and also unsure whether the promises she had been given would ever be honoured, which indeed they were not. Finally, the grievance outcome confirms the seriousness of what had gone wrong. All 7 points were upheld, and the report concluded that there was no sufficient basis for formal internal investigation or police action at that stage, while also criticising the way that Lucy had been treated. The document concludes very strongly that consultants on the unit had orchestrated what was described as the victimisation of Lucy Letby. Lucy was treated as though she was under suspicion without any evidence, while the deeper clinical problems on the unit were never confronted in the way that they should have been. This is not a narrative of guilt, this is the story of a nurse caught in a collapsing institutional response, then left to carry the weight of that collapse herself. The toll on Lucy must have been enormous. A letter from her parents sent to the hospital indicated the emotional and psychological illness and even tangible physical signs that Lucy was exhibiting. In normal circumstances, this would have been one of the worst times of her life. And yet, sadly, the nightmare was only just beginning.